there. It's like what we've discovered with multispectral imaging with other aspects of the work at the Maxwell Institute. We can recover damaged text if the text is there, but sometimes it's not there. We've come across texts where these things have just been washed clean. You can look at them all you want, forever and ever and ever, under the most refined lenses, microscopic analysis. The ink's gone. It's not there. It can't be retrieved. That's the limit of what you can do. Well, I don't want to bore you too much, but I want to go through some of the, I don't mind boring you a little bit. I've been quoting lately something I'm really fond of. It's a definition of the word professor that I like. Some of you may have heard me use it. A professor, the definition goes, is someone who talks in other people's sleep. I think that's very apt. In my case, I talked through their newspaper reading. Matt Roper contributed a piece to this called Nephi's Neighbors, Book of Mormon Peoples and Pre-Columbian Populations. And he looks at the assumption that the peoples in the Book of Mormon were the only inhabitants of the pre-Columbian New World, and thus the sole ancestors of all Amerindians. And he points out that it's been a long-standing idea in the church, and from leaders of the church on down. It's not just some recent farm's attempt to redefine the Book of Mormon. There have been leaders of the church, members of the First Presidency and so on, who've raised the issue of other people being here in the Americas before the Book of Mormon people arrived. And in fact, archaeologically, that's inescapably so. That simply is true. There's no way around it. So the Book of Mormon peoples, the Native American peoples that we meet today, are presumably at the most a mixture of Book of Mormon peoples with other people who are there. Again, we're going back to the idea of Michael Whiting that the DNA of these people would be swamped out as they merge with a larger population. As a lot of them are killed in massive wars and so on, their DNA signature is going to disappear. Roper followed this study with another one called, I like the title, Swimming in the Gene Pool. Israelite kinship relations, genes, and genealogy. And he looks at the nature of the people of the ancient Near Eastern Israel and in Lehite Israel and shows how complex kin terms and tribal lineage terms are among those peoples, and how, a very simplified picture just doesn't match the reality of what was going on there. And finally, there's an article by Brian Stubbs called Elusive Israel and the Numerical Dynamics of Population Mixing, where he shows how quickly, just with a small rate of intermarriage, eventually people will merge with another people nearby them and cease to be distinct. And it's amazingly quick, and it doesn't require a very high rate of intermarriage over time if it's a continuous process. Now, in a very real sense, I would argue the debate is or should be over. I mean, I say, again, I think the Icelandic example is definitive. You can't trace people you know existed 150 years ago in large quantities. What about one family or two or three families from 2,600 years ago? And you don't know anything about their genetics. Roughly 3 years ago, the Signature Books webpage still featured an admission from that Australian plant geneticist and former Latter-day Saint, who's the most vocal critic of the Book of Mormon on DNA grounds, that, quote, in 600 BC, there were probably several million American Indians living in the Americas. If a small group of Israelites, say less than 30, entered such a massive native population, it would be very hard to detect their genes today. Now that confession effectively concedes the whole case. The major portion, at least, of what's being argued in this book. Striking, though, as far as I can determine, that confession has disappeared from the Signature Books website. But nevertheless, we've got it. We've preserved it in print. It will not be forgotten. We're so grateful for his admission there. So the controversy continues, though at a lower level of intensity and media attention than it used to get. As this book was going to press, Terrell Gibbons came out with a wonderful essay on the subject, sort of a summary of the subject, I think. Significantly, though, the discussion today has very little to do with genetics. It has to do with interpretation of the Book of Mormon. It has to do with that question, were there other people in the land before the Book of Mormon people arrived, so that they could merge into that population? It has to do with the question of limited geography. A lot of people grew up with the notion, somehow vaguely in their minds, they hadn't thought about it much, that the Book of Mormon was the story of American Indians from Tierra del Fuego in the south to the Aleutian Islands in the north. And yet, if you actually look at the Book of Mormon carefully, it doesn't sustain such a view. You can plot the distances that are recorded in the Book of Mormon, and they are small. Now, a few hundred miles at the most in any direction. It's a very small picture. You know, just in terms of communications, it would have been impossible to maintain a civilization that went from Tierra del Fuego to the Aleutian Islands. I mean, nobody could do that in those days. The Romans couldn't carry that kind of communication on. Over there, very well-developed road system and so on. But that's the issue right now, is for example, the scholars affiliated with the Maxwell Institute reinterpreting the Book of Mormon to try to save it from scientific challenge. DNA has now effectively refuted the Book of Mormon, so the Mormon scholars are trying to shrink the Book of Mormon to make it a less inviting target or a less vulnerable target. But the fact is, it's very easy to show, because they've been in print for a long time. Theories of a limited geography for the Book of Mormon have been around since long before Crick and Watson decoded the DNA molecule. I mean, this was not done in reaction to that. It was done in reaction to careful readings of the Book of Mormon, which show that you're not talking about vast distances. It's not 10,000 miles from south to north and 3,000 or 4,000 miles from east to west. It's a small area that we're talking about and relatively small populations. Once you've granted that, a lot of the DNA stuff just always has been, and has always seemed to most of us, tempest in a teapot. There just isn't much there. I mean, okay, so a lot of people in the Americas came from Asia. So what? So what? It doesn't mean anything as far as the Book of Mormon goes. Now, if the controversy has done anything, I think it probably has put an end to the naive notion that a lot of people had, I think, without thinking about it much, that the Book of Mormon is a history of all of the Indians, all of them without exception, Eskimos and all the others down to the south. It's a history of a very specific group, and not even a complete history of them. It's a very limited, it's a very significant document. It's a very limited document in what it's talking about. I think this has been the death blow to that, which is fine because most of us didn't believe it anyway for a long time. I mean, even when I was growing up as a little kid, I think I sort of vaguely had a notion that the Book of Mormon was the history of the American Indians before a certain period. Nevertheless, I can still remember growing up in Southern California, the California Intermountain News came, and we'd pick it up at church, and I always had advertisements for trips to Book of Mormon lands. They were never to Wisconsin or Saskatchewan. They were always to Central America. I mean, it was just always there. I don't think people were thinking very clearly about it, but somehow we knew the great civilizations were down there somewhere. That's where the story most likely happened for the most part. And, you know, is Alaska a Book of Mormon land? I don't think so. One here does, okay. Well, it might be in somewhere. I'll have to hear about this. Okay. But, you know, the fact is the majority of the story takes place in a very small, very circumscribed area. Does that make the Book of Mormon trivial? Not at all. I mean, the story of Jesus' life takes place over just a few hundred square miles, basically. It's the most significant story ever. But the fact is that a limited geography flows inescapably from the text. Now, some people are trying to say that the Book of Mormon scholars, Latter-day Saint scholars, are in a panic over this. I've been told that I'm in utter despairing, you know, it's a desperate rearguard action. I'm on my heels and don't have anywhere to back up to anymore. You know, some say we're literally all over the map, you know. Some hold to a limited Mesoamerican model, but others insist the Book of Mormon narrative covers both North and South America. Well, there aren't many of those out there. I mean, they're arguing seriously for it. Or simply the vicinity of New York State, or the upper Midwest of the United States, or even the Malay Peninsula. Well, you know, you can always find somebody out there who's arguing for something like this. But the consensus of Latter-day Saint scholars is what it has been for a long time, that basically the story takes place in a limited geographical area in Mesoamerica. One vocal internet critic said this: "It may come as a surprise to some readers that there are many apologists who see the Book of Mormon events as having occurred outside the Americas." Many? He cites one self-published book that I've never heard of before. The weight of scientific evidence against the possibility of an American setting has been sufficiently compelling, and their faith in the historical claims of the Book of Mormon sufficiently rigid, that they, all those non-American, you know, Book of Mormon geographers, have looked elsewhere. So there's one guy that thinks it happened in Malaysia. You know, so anyway. Well, it should be obvious, I hope, to people who seriously engage these essays, that the simplistic claims that DNA has done in the Book of Mormon are wrong. They're false, it's not true, it's wishful thinking, it's propaganda, it's not science. The science does not dictate this negative conclusion. Of course, studies of Amerindian DNA haven't proven the Book of Mormon either. I'm not going to make that claim. That would be equally false. The fact is, they're largely irrelevant to the truth claims of the Book of Mormon. They don't have much to do with it. It would be really nice if we found some DNA marker that said Jewish on it under the microscope.